Hey, this is Clint, and welcome to the Biblical Millionaire Blueprint. Welcome to my outdoor classroom. So there's unlimited seating, so we're going to enjoy the journey. We're going to be going over the Bible's greatest investor. So you can take a minute and think, who do you think would be the Bible's greatest investor? You know, it's interesting. You think, well, Clint, why do we have to talk about the people in the Bible? What does that have to do with today? How does someone who lived 2,000 years ago, how are they going to help us with our investing? Well, one of the things we got to understand is this. When you listen to Jesus and what he spoke, and you listen to Solomon and how he spoke, did they speak about techniques and how to take care of it? Did Jesus say, okay, when you pray, pray in this way. Fold your hands and close your eyes, and this is the way that you pray. No, he didn't say that. He said, pray in this way, and then he spoke what that was. Jesus didn't speak in terms of technique. King Solomon didn't say about the techniques. They talked about the principles. So one thing about principles, and this is awesome, when you grab a hold of this, it works for any area of your life. Because some people think, well, the principles are gone, that's old-fashioned. You know what, there's some old-fashioned things that we need to keep doing, and it's the principles. So if we take the principle of reaping and sowing, it's something that still works today as it did a few thousand years ago. So a principle is something that works for all people, in all places, for all time. All people, in all places, for all time. So you can take a principle, we're going to take these principles, and you're going to be able to connect them to today, from the principles to the practical. So this is going to be really awesome. Now, if you were thinking, who is the Bible's greatest investor? I'm going to say that it's Joseph in the book of Genesis, when we have the story of Joseph. Now, let's go through that we're going to go through it very quickly, because most of you know what that story is about. So he's a guy who, his brothers couldn't stand him. He had 10 or 11 half brothers. They couldn't stand him. He had a bunch of dreams, and he said, you guys are going to be bowing down to me. They hated him. They threw him in a pit. They took him out of the pit. They sold him into slavery. He went into Egypt. He was in Potiphar's house. He got accused wrongly and was thrown in prison, and he ended up coming up out of prison because Pharaoh had a dream, and the dream bothered him. So the dream was about 7 years of feasting and 7 years of famine. So it's going to be 7 great years, all kinds of bumper crop. It's going to be awesome. A lot of excess, a lot of bonuses, a lot of commissions. But then there's going to be 7 years where there's nothing that's going to be coming in. And there's going to be dry. It's going to be a famine. So most people, when they tell the story of this in the church, when Joseph's brothers show up to him after they had treated him wrongly, after several years prior they had treated him wrongly, and they show up and they bow before him, and Joseph sees his brothers and he puts them through a crazy bunch of experiences, and he finally looks at his brothers and says, and he tells them, I forgive you. And in the church, the story ends right there. Okay, everything's good. He forgave his brothers. That's awesome. But this is actually where the investing, after this, is where the investment part of the story begins. And it says that as they were gathering, what they did was, the command was this, is that they would be able to keep 4/5 or 80% of their income. And Joseph commanded that they had to give, it was basically their grain. We're going to store the grain. We're going to store 20% of whatever you're producing. We're going to put that away for the government in the government granaries. Now, this is the boom time. So they have 7 years of this going on. So they're taking this amount and then they're able to put it away. Now what happens is, and I should have wrote the word famine here, but in this section here, what they end up doing is they end up living off of 20% of their income during the famine, during the boom time. So now probably even less than 20% is what they're going to be living off of when there's a famine. So this is a great, obviously the nation of Egypt was saved because of Joseph and his idea, and Israel in Canaan, they were also saved. Many of the people were saved from Canaan because they came to buy grain because Egypt was prepared. So that's still not the investment part of this. This is basically good management, so they were saved from not dying of starvation and everything else that comes with a famine. So as we look at this process, now the 7 years are broken up into four, I'm going to say 4 different areas. After a certain amount of time, the people came to Joseph and they said, hey, we're out of grain, we're going to need more grain. And he said, okay, give me all your money. So basically Joseph had cleared out their savings, their IRA, their retirement, and this was going to be, they needed everything they could get, everything they could sell for grain. Now what's happening here? Joseph is he has capitalized on something that's in a great lack. He has capitalized on as far as the cost of this. And he took that money and he put it into Pharaoh's treasuries. They came back approximately another year or two later. There's not an exact time specification of this, but the next thing that they did, Joseph said, okay, now give me your flocks and give me your herds. Give me your cattle, your donkeys, all modes of transportation. I'm going to take that. They said, hey, it's better than starving. We'll sell it all to you. Everything for grain. You can have this and we'll take the grain. So he wiped out all of their vehicles, their equipment, anything that was income generating. He ended up having that in Pharaoh's possession. Now, the one thing you got to understand about Egypt is a fairly large country. Today, Egypt takes up approximately the size of 15 states in the United States. So if you can imagine one central figure accessing everyone's savings, everyone's retirement, and now they're going to have everyone's vehicles, they're going to have everyone's tractors and equipment and tools, and you name it. Then after another period of time, they come back and they said, hey, we're starving again. We need some more grain. So Joseph said, okay, and they volunteer and they say, you know what, you can have our houses, you can have our land. And so Joseph proceeds to take those things for the price of grain. Now imagine this, a year's supply of grain could have been going for the price of a whole entire house and real estate. So if the people own their real estate, I mean, they could have been paying $150,000 for a year's supply of grain. Whew. Now Joseph is capitalizing on this. I mean, this is the shrewd business side of Joseph that most people don't talk about, but this is how he worked, and it was even to make Egypt wealthy, not Israel. At this point, it's not making Israel wealthy, but later on it will. And that's a whole nother story. So they volunteer, besides the real estate, is to say, you know what, we'll give ourselves up as slaves. So he moved into the asset now of taking the real estate, and then it took their ability, basically their earning potential, their entrepreneurship. They sold themselves as slaves to Egypt. Whew. Now see what's going on here. Joseph is actually setting up Egypt. It's like worse than communism, because now they owned the people, they owned all the real estate, they owned the vehicles, they owned all the businesses. So the people were completely in Joseph's hands. Now that's not bad if you have a kind ruler, as Pharaoh at that particular Pharaoh was a good ruler, and he followed whatever Joseph would say. Pharaoh would say, just do whatever Joseph says. So we see this whole thing. Now what's happening? Joseph is literally turning Egypt into not only a multi-billion, maybe even a trillion-dollar entity in the middle of a famine. That's why Joseph is the Bible's greatest investor. So if you could imagine all the acreage, there's 30 million acres in Pennsylvania. And if each acre is just sold for $20,000, that's a huge. I was running numbers and doing some. It was hundreds of billions of dollars. So not only that, all the real estate, all the savings, the whole thing. So you say, well, how does that kind of stuff apply to today? Well, let me give you two examples of businessmen who applied that principle in their time. If we go back to the late 1800s, Milton Hershey lived in Lancaster County, right here in Lancaster County, and then he bought Derry Township and he started to make chocolate. So Hershey chocolate, which is known around the world, at that time, if we go back to that time, caramel was the main candy that people ate. And he experimented. He actually had a caramel factory and actually sold it for around $1 million at the turn of right at the turn of the century, which was a huge amount of money that he could move because he wanted to go with chocolate. He felt like the American people were ready to eat chocolate and more of it. So he actually rode that wave. There was a transition from caramel to chocolate where he built an entire town of Hershey. If you've been to Hershey Park, there's the Hershey Theater. Everything's Hershey in Hershey. And even the workers that came there, he had houses built and sold them to the workers. There's at least 6,000 homes where people who also worked at Hershey. So he had this expansion. He had a big idea and he rode this thing at the right time. This is exactly what Joseph did. So this principle is being applied at this point in time. Down at the other end of the county, in the next county over, we have Herr's potato chips. And in the 1940s is when Mr. Herr decided to start cooking chips in a kettle. Him and his wife, they worked together and they started Herr's Chips, and now have a huge factory. They have snack foods that are shipped all across the country. And the one thing that Mr. Herr realized was in the 1940s and 50s, when the television started to come out and people were able to purchase a new television, they were going to sit around at night and they were going to start eating snacks. So he capitalized on that wave to be able to take advantage of it because of something that people wanted. So it was a great movement, a great thing for timing when it comes to being a great investor. So you have to look at that. You have to look at that in your situation, and you have to know how to move on each of the investments, but potential investments in front of you before other people make the moves on it. So what I like to do is to be able to give you the tools in your hand to be able to think, what situation am I in that I can begin to think like an investor and be able to capitalize on the upswing in whatever area I'm looking at. If I enjoy working with stocks, if I enjoy working with real estate, if I enjoy working with something on the internet, whatever it is. So that entrepreneurship and the investing mindset, the biblical millionaire mindset, the two things are closely related. You know, entrepreneurship and investing are like cousins. There's a whole lot of similarities between the two. So you have to think and work with what you have and what you can do with it and how you can see it grow. Because that's the direction that we're going, is to be able to become a biblical millionaire, and we want to grow in this aspect. So Joseph, I see, as the Bible's greatest investor. You want to take those principles and whatever ideas that God is giving you, whatever ideas come into your mind as this is being shared, you want to grab a hold of that, write it down, and you want to be able to move in that direction, whatever that might be. So I'm Clint Frank, and thanks for being in my outdoor classroom. And this is your Biblical Millionaire Blueprint. I'll see you in the next one.